Welcome to American Common Sense, a fun look at the state of American politics, inspired by Thomas Paine's Common Sense from 1776, hosted by James Humphreys. Good afternoon. So, in a previous video, we were talking about the three branches of government and how they are meant to interact with one another. It was kind of generic. So today I want to be a lot more specific about something that's happening right now that everyone will understand that's in the news and that you can follow along with. First, I want to go back to that same quote by George Washington that I use in every podcast. It matters to me a great deal. It says, "In proportion as the structure of a government gives force to public opinion, it is essential that public opinion should be enlightened." I guess the days of us being stupid are supposed to be over. George Washington wanted us to be smart about these things. I imagine the average person should be able to read our Constitution, the Bill of Rights, any amendment, and understand what it means in order to have it. As I said before, I recommend that everyone, whether you're into politics or not, have this handy-dandy little pocket constitution that you can keep somewhere in a drawer or in your library in your own home, so that if something sounds a little funny to you, you can look it up yourself and read it and go, I'm not so sure about that, or I can see where they're talking about. That being said, let's go back to the legislative branch and talk just a little bit about separation of powers that are proper. So, according to Section 1 of the U.S. Constitution, the legislative power is to do a whole bunch of things. In fact, it has a whole list. It's Article 1, Section 8 has an entire laundry list of things that we're supposed to do as members of the legislative branch for Congress, for the House and the Senate. I'm going to remind everyone once again, just in case, don't think of it as an upper chamber and a lower chamber. The Senate is not more important than the House of Representatives. In fact, the people that are closest to us are supposed to be the U.S. House members that we elect every 2 years. So we're supposed to be able to get a hold of them and talk with them and share our opinions with them and have the most influence over what's happening in our government by talking to those very representatives. So never be shy about finding them, tracking them down and talking to them whenever you feel it's appropriate. So, in Article 1, Section 8, it talks about all the things that they're supposed to do. So, we go back to what the legislative branch does. It writes all the laws. And everything that they put out, including resolutions, have some of those same powers. That includes the budget. It includes creating departments. It includes declaring war. All of those things are powers reserved for the legislative branch. The executive branch, or the president, who's the head of the executive branch, their job is to enforce the law as written. And if somebody doesn't like that, then they either got to convince Congress to change the law, or they have to put pressure on Congress to address some sort of problem that exists. One example of those would be in 2017 with the family separation policy that took place at the southern border during President Trump's first term in office. Now, there are a lot of people across the entire country, myself included, who found the idea of doing what they did rather deplorable. However, if you read the law as it is currently written, that's precisely what it says to do, and the president was doing exactly what he was supposed to do. Now, a lot of people didn't like it, and they wanted to put pressure on President Trump to stop doing that, but that was encouraging President Trump to not follow the law. It was Congress's job to fix that so that it's not a problem. Guess what? There was enough public pressure. President Trump eventually changed that policy and stopped separating families at the border, but he did so by violating the law because Congress never went back and fixed it. That law still stands today. And technically, at the southern border today, that means people who are crossing illegally that aren't able to file for full asylum using an app or other types of ways to get a hold of people before they get to the border are in just as much jeopardy of having that same policy enforced in the same way because Congress failed to do its job. The public doesn't like that policy. If the public doesn't like the policy, Congress should fix it. It shouldn't be up to the president to have to pick and choose which laws he will or will not obey. Another thing we talk about that fits today really well that's in that space is we'll pick something simple like USAID, the Department of Education, the U.S. Institute for Peace. Any of these departments or departments or agencies that are meant to be created by Congress, which they have been, that are receiving funding from Congress, and that the current administration is trying to scale back or shut down. And there are a couple of very distinct examples that are different. At the very beginning of the current administration, the move was made to close or shutter USAID. And that is very different from what was happening with something called the U.S. Institute for Peace, which was created by Ronald Reagan in 1984. There, the president ordered that it be shrunk to its minimum statutory requirements. Those two actions are very different. Both of those small agencies are under the U.S. State Department. They are independent agencies. One was created by the Foreign Relations Act of 1961, and one was created by the Peace Initiative of 1984. Both are independent agencies, like I said, under the State Department. And so they have their own directors, they have their own missions, language that defines what they're supposed to do. At the beginning of 2025, President Trump instructed his DOGE team to close USAID and to shutter foreign aid and split it into other different spaces. That act changes how money already allocated by Congress is meant to be spent. And it closes a department that has been authorized by Congress that, while under the State Department, acts as an independent agency separate from the State Department. So the question has to be asked, was that legal? Is it okay for the president to change how funds are allocated by Congress, how they're meant to be spent, or to choose not to spend them at all? And is it appropriate for the president to close an agency authorized by Congress without approval from Congress to close the agency first? Those are really important questions, and those are questions that the legislative branch should have asked. They should have gone, hey, wait a minute, I'm sorry, Mr. President, we created that branch, that organization. It's up to us to decide if we want to close it. They have their own independent material. And so knowing that there was a conflict that existed, when a few weeks later, the order came down from President Trump to close the U.S. Institute for Peace, he didn't order its closure. He ordered it to be shrunk to its minimum statutory requirements, indicating that he wasn't closing it, he wasn't changing its direction or changing its purpose, but he wanted it shrunk in a way that made it more affordable for the American taxpayer without sacrificing its ability to accomplish its task. Those are two very different approaches taken for two very similar agencies. And the reason for that was because a number of lawsuits were filed in the judiciary. Because Congress didn't ask the question, hey, Mr. President, what are you doing with USAID over here? That development agency is something we created and only we can uncreate it. Instead of asking that question, which is their responsibility because they allocated the funds and so forth, members of that organization or those who benefited from that organization, either foreign governments or contractors in the United States that were receiving funds from that organization under those contracts, had to go to the judiciary to ask for intervention and clarification. What does the law state? Where does the president's power to adjust what's happening end? And where does Congress's power to adjust what's happening begin? No such issue exists with the U.S. Institute for Peace that exists with USAID. In fact, a lawsuit was filed over this last weekend, March 20th or so of 2025, where the U.S. Institute for Peace asked a court to intervene and create a temporary restraining order to prevent the president's DOGE team from accessing and shrinking their department. And that lawsuit was tossed out by the same federal district court in D.C. that upheld issues for a temporary restraining order on USAID. And why? Because the requirement that the president's executive branch leadership made with U.S. Institute for Peace is inside the scope of what the president is allowed to do. He's allowed to shrink or enlarge that group as much as he can. He's not changing how much money they have. He's not changing where that money is going. He's not canceling those contracts with subcontractors to make that work. He's not doing anything that is constitutionally mandated to Congress himself. What he is doing is shrinking the staff to find a space to meet the minimum statutory requirements. So the two different agencies, two completely different outcomes, and we won't know for probably a few years, depending on how things work through the courts and the appellate process and the Supreme Court, where the line is drawn for the president's executive power with USAID, as opposed to the U.S. Institute for Peace, which is going to go through a transition without having to have additional congressional oversight. And my guess is that legislatively there will be a budget change in the 2026 budget year that will more accurately reflect what the president's intent for the U.S. Institute for Peace is, as opposed to the ongoing fight we're going to see with USAID. I hope this is helpful, and I hope this makes common sense to you. There are limitations to what everyone can and cannot do, and we, as the members of the public, not only should understand what those differences are, but we should know where to place our pressure. Just like I said a few moments ago when talking about that family separation policy, there are lots of people who are upset with what was happening with USAID. That pressure shouldn't be brought to bear on the executive branch. The pressure should be brought to bear on the legislative branch, who's supposed to be in charge of the budget. If that's not being handled the way it's supposed to be, instead of waiting on the courts to have to manage this over the course of several years, as a conflict has obviously arisen between the legislative and the executive branch, the legislative branch should be forcing itself back into that picture, saying, this is our responsibility, this is your responsibility, and if the two sides can't come to an agreement on that, then the courts get involved in order to create that delineation. That's how our form of government works. And so rather than putting all of our pressure on the president to choose to obey or not obey a law as written by Congress, if the law's not right, if we don't like how what's happening, we need to put our pressure on the lawmakers and encourage them to do their job to assert their authority as a co-equal branch of government. I hope this is making some sense to everyone. I would like to know in the comments below what your thoughts are, whether this makes common sense to any of you. And now I want to talk about how we get there. That's that fourth branch of government that I mentioned in another video. We all know the executive, legislative, and judicial branch exist in the U.S. Constitution, but we also talked about the states as a whole being its own co-equal branch of government. And I gave an example with marijuana, and I'm going to give it again, so those who haven't watched that video, we'll put a link in the description or in one of the corners for people to see, for those who are on YouTube as opposed to the podcast. But what I want is for people to recognize that the states are powerful institutions, and they're not always 100% subservient. There are exceptions to every rule. The supremacy clause of the U.S. Constitution is on an individual state-by-state basis. However, as a collective, the states are very powerful. Marijuana was the example that I gave before, and I'll give it to you again. During the Obama administration, Washington and Oregon passed initiatives that made medical marijuana legal in their states. The Obama administration had an opportunity at that moment in time to sue and say federal law supersedes state law. In this case, we want to stop them from being able to apply medical marijuana, and we want to enforce federal law. We chose not to do that. The consequence of them choosing not to do that is now virtually every state, 15 years later, has some form of marijuana laws on the books that make it legal in various types of circumstances, which means federal law is irrelevant. It only applies to the U.S. military or federal workers. The consequence being that at some point in time, the federal government will be forced to have to change the law to accommodate what the states have already done, because no one's going to enforce those federal laws in those jurisdictions. Trying to get the court to intervene at this point in time would be moot, and they would likely lose in court as much as they're likely to win in court. So that's a big deal. The reason I mention that is because the U.S. House of Representatives, your own state legislatures, for the vast majority of states in this country, are easy to access. I live in a state called Utah. And here in Utah, we have 75 members of the U.S. House of Representatives. That's one representative for every 45 to 50,000 people in the entire state of Utah. You know how easy it is to find where my legislator lives down the street? Knock on the door and say, hey, how you doing? I have an issue with this. I kind of want to see if you can help me with it. That's nearly as easy as being able to call a local federal building and say, hey, I want to talk to my congressman about this issue. I want to leave a message, talk to a member of their staff. This is important to me, and I want them to know where I stand on this issue. It's much easier to get a hold of these people and to make sure that our voices are heard than it is to get a hold of someone in the executive branch, because they're representing representatives from all 50 states. But we have influence in our own neighborhoods, and most of our states are small, with small populations, which means accessing both our state legislature and finding out who and how to access gain access to our member of Congress so we can talk to them about the things that matter to us is the easiest way for our voices to be heard. It's much better than yelling at the TV when the news is on and we don't like what we hear, or disagreeing and fighting with your uncle or your daughter or your aunt, at the Thanksgiving table. You want to make sure your voice is heard? That's an easy way to do it. Again, I'm James Humphreys. I host this wonderful podcast. I hope that you've enjoyed yourself and you've learned something. I hope this makes common sense to you. And I would love to hear more from you in the comments below about what you want to hear about, or whether you agree or disagree. And let's have a good discussion among our community. Thank you, and we'll see you in the next one.